So, you could probably look this up, but this all started back in, I guess, it was 86. These posters had been up for a year, or posters like them, all made by the same chicks. I assumed that they were chicks. They always wore gorilla masks, so who the fuck knew, right? But it's like a decade ago, back at like 86 or so. And I'm walking down Broadway in Soho with my brother and his kid. Just a young kid, that little rugrat. He's like 4 or maybe 7. I don't know, I can't tell the difference. But he was learning how to read then. He's memorized all of the basics up and down the street, like no parking, street cleaning. This kid was ready to park a fucking car in Manhattan. We stop outside my gallery. Me and Mike Sr., my brother, we're talking about whatever, not paying attention to Michael Jr. He's standing between us, gawking up at some flyer on the lamppost. And all of a sudden, he says, "Uncle Patrick, why don't you like girls?" I stop pretending to listen to whatever my brother's saying. I ask the kid, "What are you talking about, Mikey?" He says, "Why don't you like girls?" I turn to my brother and he's grinning at me. He says, "Oh, I think Patrick likes girls." And the kid's still looking up. He says, "But the sign," and he points at it. "It says you don't let women into your gallery." We all looked up at this poster. The Gorilla Girls had done another tally. Now, I'd seen one of these things before. They'd counted up how many women some of the big museums had shown in solo shows the year before. Yeah, pretty much 0. Now they went after gallerists like me. They'd counted up how many women we'd recently shown. Marion Goodman showed 0 women in 85 and 1 in 86. Mary Boone had goose eggs both years. Leo dropped from 4 to 3. Marlboro dropped from 2 to 1. There were 18 galleries named on this thing, and most of them only showed 1 or no women. And that included me. At least my nephew knew how to spell our last name. The Patrick Bowman Gallery. 0 chicks in 85, and another 0 in 86. The kid says zeros in both lines, 0, 0. They put a comment next to your name. It says, "Unforgive." Yeah, kid, I can read, thanks. My brother grins like the smug Wall Street prick he is and says, "Not very 80s of you." I tell him, "Oh, whatever, Mike. How many women work in your office who aren't secretaries?" He thinks for a good long while and finally says, I think there's a lady in the mailroom." I wouldn't think about this shit again, but the kid goes and tells his mom, my sister-in-law Clarice, and she relishes bringing that shit up. The kid starts calling me Uncle Zeros. He does this in public. We'd meet up at a restaurant where there are other people in the business, and this kid's yelling, "Hi, Uncle Zeros." I look at Mike and Clarice, and those jerks are laughing at it. I think they told him to do it. God, keep your kid under control, guys. Come on. I have to explain to people why this kid is calling me Uncle Zeros. It's embarrassing. Not that I did anything about it. I wasn't looking for any new artists. I can usually take on maybe 1 new artist every year. That's all I have time or room for. So it's not like I'd all of a sudden have this giant stable of lady artists. But a couple years later, in 89, I saw this new poster that the Gorilla Girls put up. Thank God it didn't name me again, because that kid could read like a Rhodes Scholar by then. It did give me an idea, though. In big, bold letters across the top, it said, "When racism and sexism are no longer fashionable, what will your art collection be worth?" Jesus Christ, right? What? A Jasper Johns had recently sold for $18 million at auction, and this poster contended that you could buy works from 67 different women, one from each of them, for the same price as the Johns. And there were famous names on that list, even for back then, like Georgia O'Keeffe, Frida Kahlo, Mary Cassatt, Ava Hesse, just goes on and on and on. And supposedly, at least in '89, you could buy a work by each of them for the same price as one Jasper Johns. So I started thinking maybe there's an untapped market here. Collectors love a good deal. They want to feel like they're getting in on something before anyone else. It makes them feel smart, not just financially, but intellectually. Most of these guys make wads of dough doing the most boring fucking shit in the world. They want art to make them not so boring to the imported models they're banging at the Roxy. So I ripped down the poster and realized that I had something new for a sales pitch. But I still didn't have any women on my list. I'm not a secondary market guy, no, so I didn't want to go looking for the women who are already on that list. How many of them were even alive still? So I had one of my gallery girls go through all the slides that had been dropped off in the past 2 years. I told her to pull out all the women. I never look through these things, man or woman. I'm very equal opportunity when it comes to schlubs dropping off slides. There's no opportunity there. But for the first time since I started out, I fired up the light table, dusted off the loop, and I scanned through these damn things one at a time. I hate looking at slides. I much rather have my people tell me what's good, and then if they can convince me that they're actually excited about it, and they're not just fucking the guy, then I'll have my assistant go check it out. And then if she actually thinks it's worth my time away from everything else I gotta do at the gallery, then I'll go look at it. Sitting down with thousands of slides at a light table is fucking murder. I sat down, I placed the hand lens on the first slide at the top left corner, and I went one by one across the table, row after row, sheet after sheet. My eyes bled after a box of these things. I couldn't tell one painting from the next after a couple of sheets. After a while, I realized that I only paid attention to bright colors because nothing else stood out. That's not a way to decide what to go look at in person. I actually thought that this would be fun, bring me back to my salad days. Well, fuck my salad days. I was about to give up after my headache got worse for the 15th time after squinting into the hand lens for hours. But then, I actually found something that I recognized. Images from a show I'd seen at Daryl Stanton's a year earlier. A little gal you might know named Celia Merode. I don't know if I liked them because I'd actually seen them before, there was that familiarity, or if I really thought that they'd be worth checking out again. I was into them when I saw them at Stanton's. The nudes reminded me of what the feminists were doing in the 70s, like Schneemann, Wilkie, but they had this raw new power, maybe something like Kiki Smith, who I'd been seeing recently at Fawbush. Basically, they were the right amount of old and new, because a collector doesn't want something that's too new. That's dangerous. Who knows if that'll ever pay off? But if you can convince the collector that this is the next direction that art is taking, then you have them pinched by the taint. However, I hadn't had this happen to me in more than a decade. Your Miss Celia Merode wouldn't take my calls. First, I had my assistant Kelly call her. She left messages. I heard one of these messages. It wasn't like Kelly didn't drop my name or gush over how much I'd like to see her work. Celia just didn't call back. I had Kelly go down to Stanton's place a few blocks away, and that pile of dog puke had the gall to berate Kelly just for mentioning Celia's name. So Kelly calls Celia's apartment one more time, and she gets her roommate on the phone. Apparently, Celia works 3 jobs. She's never home. I say, call back that roommate. Ask if any of those jobs are making art. She calls the roommate back. And no, none of the jobs are making art. Ask her if she's repped by anybody. No, she isn't repped by anybody. Ask her if Celia wants to make art. Oh, yeah, she wants to make art. Then why the fuck isn't she calling me back? I don't like being dicked around, so I gave up. I didn't want to waste any more time on this. I couldn't care less. My list was already full anyway. It was just a fun little idea that I went way overboard on one week. Yes, Kelly. Yes, lucky for me, she cared. I learned where Celia worked from her roommate. The roommate was quite rude when I asked for Celia's specific schedule. She said she didn't keep track of such things. But I had an objective. I knew Patrick's list, and I loved many of those men. Some of them, perhaps not so much. In the 80s and 90s, and, well, in the aughts as well, I always needed to tell new gallery girls that they must grin and bear so-and-so's comments, or so-and-so's inappropriate requests. Long story short, I was dying to work with a woman. I'd seen the Gorilla Girls posters over the years, of course. I wanted to be a Gorilla Girl. And whenever I tried arousing Patrick's interest in a woman, he'd jokingly accuse me of being a Gorilla Girl. I also grinned and bore it. I'd seen Patrick's name on those lists. It was his name, but I was his assistant. Everyone in the art world who dealt with Patrick was usually actually dealing with me. To see Patrick's name on those posters felt no different than seeing my own name plastered across Soho. So if he was interested in Celia Merode, I would find her. He'd already spent nearly an hour at the light table to find Merode. I knew he wouldn't look at any more slides himself. So I did coax her roommate to grudgingly tell me that Celia worked at an artist supply store on Avenue A, and at a thrift shop near Astor Place, and at Manic Panic on St. Mark's in the East Village. I'd never heard of the first two, but I lived a block away from Manic Panic. I started to drop in before and after work, which made me more than a tad bit nervous. See, the establishment was still very, well, I suppose they might call it punk then, and I was the opposite of punk. I'd walk in wearing my little black dress, the de facto outfit for nearly every day at the gallery, and there would invariably be somebody infinitely cooler than me working behind the counter. I was still very fresh from Connecticut then, mind you. No, the artists that we worked with at our gallery never really made me nervous, but walking into Manic Panic always made me feel as if I'd just taken the train across Long Island instead of the Hampton Jitney. The place was minuscule. My parents and Darian had bedroom closets that were much larger, and they had all these pairs of shoes hanging by nails on the wall. They didn't have shoe racks, and they had all these vintage clothes and all the little tubs of hair dye, and of course the incredibly cool girls working behind the counter, and they always looked something like Kate Bush or Lydia Lunch. So I may have flinched when they greeted me with a very warm smile. I thought they mocked me that first time, though I quickly realized that they were merely relaxed compared to anyone we hired at our own front desks. I always asked about Celia, and they told me how much they loved her, but no, she wouldn't be in that day. I'd need to come back. I don't know what I pictured, but she wasn't quite what I expected. Her hair wasn't dyed like any of the other girls, and she was bobbing along to the music on the stereo. She seemed happy. None of the men that Patrick worked with were ever particularly happy, unless they were very drunk. But on the other hand, when some of them were very drunk, They were very mean. I pulled one of Celia's slides out of my purse and held it up as if it was a badge, as if I was sent by the FBI or something. I asked, "Are you Celia Merode?" She seemed surprised by the slide. She took it from my hand and held it up to the light. She said, "Yeah, this is me." I introduced myself and reached to shake her hand, but she hesitated. I said, "I've tried reaching you for some time now." And after awkwardly holding my hand out for another 5 seconds, she finally reached to shake it. She said, "You've left a lot of messages." I told her yes, I had. My apologies, I hope I haven't filled your answering machine. And she asked, "Why hasn't Bowman called me himself?" Well, I said, "He's very busy, but he's very interested in seeing your work in person. Maybe something from the figure drawing show?" I tried visiting Daryl Stanton, but he said that you weren't working together anymore. So I hope that perhaps you sold these works in editions. And without any emotion, she said, "I burned them." "You burned them?" And she repeated it. "Burned them, up in flames, kaput. It wasn't what I wanted out in the world." I said, "I see. Well, do you have other pieces?" And she asked, "Does Patrick Bowman want to see pieces from this series?" She waved the slide in the air. And I said, "I think that would be helpful. He actually saw that show. He remembered it. It's what made him want to see your work again." And she said, "Then I don't think we can work together," and turned to the store's stereo. I nearly had to yell, "You can't?" because she turned up the music so loudly. I believe she said, "No, I think it'd be best if I looked elsewhere for representation." I tried not to be offended, or not to offend her, but this was the stupidest thing I'd ever heard. I said, Do you have other potential gallerists looking at your work?" And she finally turned back to me and said, "I've been talking to people at AIR and someone at Collab. I'm pretty sure I'm going to line up another show soon." These were artist collectives. I liked their work, of course, and many women like Jenny Holzer and Kiki Smith had started their careers with them. But these were comparatively small operations. I was giving Celia an opportunity to bypass them. Not knowing what else to do, I said, "I'm going to leave my card. I loved your figure drawing show. I really did. And I'm going to be your #1 advocate. I can practically guarantee that we'd show 1 or 2 of your pieces in a group show. Patrick would really like to diversify his list. He really would. And if the pieces sell, I will convince him to take you on as a client. You will be able to bypass showing your work at artist-run spaces. You won't need to work 3 jobs anymore. But if nothing else, if you work with us, if we can form a relationship, you will be able to spend much more of your time making art." She didn't even raise an eyebrow. I left the card on the counter, not knowing if she'd ever pick it up. Weeks later, I noticed that Manic Panic had closed. I heard that rent doubled. So Celia was down to 2 jobs. If she hadn't been fired from her second job at the thrift shop soon after, she might not have felt desperate enough to walk through our gallery's door with my card. April 12th, 1989. Christian Coalition. Reverend Pat Robertson. Dear Coalition member, the enclosed red envelope contains graphic descriptions of photographs depicting homosexual eroticism and other blasphemous activities. They were all funded by your tax dollars. I'd never send you the photos, but I did want you to know about the vile contents of your tax-funded material. You'll be as outraged as I am when you open the envelope. Your hard-earned tax dollars paid for this trash. taxpayer-funded, photographs too vulgar to print. Jesus Christ immersed in a vat of urine. One man holding another man's genitals. Jesus Christ shooting heroin in his arm. A cross painted with human feces and menstrual blood on a woman's nude chest. Photo of a man's arm up to the forearm in another man's rectum. One man urinating in another man's mouth. A 4-year-old girl with genitals exposed. A man sticking a large cylinder up his own rectum. A man identified as Mark Stevens, also identified as Mr. 10.5, with his genitals stretched out on a table. Pornography at the taxpayer's expense. Mr. McGuire. Mr. President, a month ago I began receiving letters and phone calls from constituents throughout the country regarding artwork by Celia Merode and other so-called artists. The messages are full of disgust, indignation, and concern for our country's future. They said you should be ashamed of using taxpayers' money to pay for this vulgar garbage. The artwork by this Merode is a photograph of the artist, if she can be called that, mocking the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, while holding herself in the position of Christ on the cross. Another cross is seen on her naked chest, painted on with menstrual blood and human feces. This artist received $10,000 for this work from the National Endowment for the Arts through the Stanton Gallery in New York City. I am not questioning this artist's right to use free speech in this matter, no matter how odious it might be. But if Miss Merode believes she can use the hard-working taxpayers' dollars to make such blasphemous work, if she believes that the endowment may be used to attack our deepest, most important American ideals, then there is something horribly wrong with how funding is dispersed through the NEA. It is a disgusting defiance of the endowment's responsibilities to have contributed to this exhibition. I have here in my hand the brochure that accompanied this artist's exhibit. Instead of declining funds, the endowment allowed its name to be proudly included on this document as a major contributor. I won't do the chamber the disfavor of showing you all the works that appear in this brochure. The photo on the easel that I'll reveal in a moment will leave you aghast enough. Mr. President, this work is so horrendous that 20 of my Senate colleagues have co-signed a letter of protest against the NEA. My greatest apologies to the chamber, but as you can see here on the easel, the image is beyond distasteful. I'm sure that even more of my colleagues will co-sign now that they too have a moment to judge for themselves. The purpose for which the endowment was established, and I quote, was to support the survival of the best of all forms that reflect the American heritage in its full range of cultural and ethnic diversity, and to provide national leadership on behalf of the art. Mr. President, funding Merode's work is a gross perversion of those principles. If artists want to be deplorable or vulgar, they might have that right, but not with the taxpayers' dollars, and not with the blessing of this great nation's name. This is despicable. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the letter to the National Endowment for the Arts be printed in the record. Goodness gracious, yes, he did. As soon as he finished reading that letter, he held up the exhibition catalog and tore it in half. Then he ripped it up into pieces. And he didn't just drop them on the ground, no. He threw them at the floor like he was pitching a fastball of confetti at the dirt. And then it stopped on him. He looked like Elmer Fudd or Yosemite Sam, rootin' and tootin', oh my gosh. And you know what? We were basically the only people in there. There weren't any other senators in there. We had been celebrating. Celia, Rachel, and myself. We stood on their roof, just 3 stories up, but high enough to feel as if we stood on top of the world. Celia had bought a bottle of disgustingly cheap champagne, a 12-pack of beer, all with money she did not yet have, but money she knew would arrive soon. She was awarded a $5,000 NEA grant, her first, all her own. She had been able to use some of the money that Tribeca Darrell was awarded for the previous year, but that was a pittance. He barely gave her enough to pay for the students' art pads and to rent the easels. A grant of her own would allow her, at least for a few months, to continue the work that she largely abandoned due to her lack of funds. Over the previous year, Celia and I had become something like each other's assistants. We weren't partners so much, or a team. We weren't really a duo either, because we did not create the same projects. We did not share ideas for the same projects. When we worked on one of Celia's pieces, it was hers. She only had her name on it. And when we worked on one of my projects, it was my piece. We did this because we liked each other's work, yes, but also because we couldn't actually afford to pay for any assistance. When I needed her to operate the camera, she was there, behind the lens. And when she wanted somebody other than herself to appear in a film, or if she needed a cameraman when it was her in the film, then I was there to help her. She even taught me how to paint the film frames, which was an incredibly painstaking job. Now, for lay art lovers, ones who believe that a great artwork needs to require great skill, they should love these painted films, because Celia and I would do what dozens of women would do in the late 1800s, the early 1900s, the very beginning of film. Those early films, the colorized ones, like A Trip to the Moon, are already so eerie, the jerky motions of the frames and the washed-out color tones. But Celia's films are even more uncanny because they blend modern technology with this rather antiquated art form, an art form that truly wasn't supposed to last after Technicolor arrived, when it wasn't necessary to dye the films anymore. Not long after we first met, she showed me the few films she had made while still in high school, and I was dumbstruck. I couldn't believe that she'd had this vision before she'd ever left Iowa. It made her more recent work feel weighed down by ideas. She never agreed with me, no, but I believe that if the concept and the conceptual art can't be understood in one brief sentence, then, well, it has more or less failed. But either way, she still did not have very much money. Even working 2 and then 3 jobs, even with the Lower East Side rent still cheap by today's standards, though it was skyrocketing as far as we were concerned. She had applied for grants the previous year by submitting her photographic work, and she was roundly rejected. After seeing these early films, I told her to submit them, but she wanted a newer piece. Her films were all more than 5 years old, and she was still in high school when she completed them. I obviously applied and was roundly rejected the year before as well. So we made a pact to each complete new works that we could submit, in the hopes of making more of that work. And after waiting many months to hear a response about our applications, Celia received a phone call. I, however, would receive a form rejection in a few days. I was still happy for her, of course. People thought I might not be. I was. I was never jealous of her in our 20s, our early and mid-20s. In fact, I was the first to celebrate with her. She and I stood at the edge of her roof, and she handed me the champagne, saying she'd never popped a bottle before. I decided that I should shake it, because we were celebrating, and this seemed to be how you celebrate. So I shook the bottle, and when I barely twisted the cork, it flew over Essex Street like a comet barreling over the Atlantic. The champagne sprayed all over the sidewalk beneath us. We didn't hear the man below. We looked over the edge, and he stared up at us, cursing us, so we leaped back into the shadows. We had drenched him in this disgusting champagne. And then we heard the roof's door open. It couldn't be the man, not so soon. We'd barely regrouped, the 3 of us, passing the bottle of champagne to one another. But no, it was not the man. It was one of Celia's Cooper Union friends, Veronica, arriving to celebrate with us. She waved a copy of The Voice above her head. She was bringing news. She yelled, "Celia!" and laughed incredibly hard, and it was like, oh my God. What, we all wondered. She was incredibly annoying, often doing these laughing spells. I assumed it was nothing. She probably farted on the way up the staircase, which always made this girl laugh, and then she'd tell everyone in case we didn't already know. She howled, "I can't believe you're in the motherfucking Voice!" Celia said, "The Voice? For what? I haven't shown anything in nearly a year." Veronica said it's because of some NEA thing. NEA thing? Why would the Voice care that Celia was given a $5,000 grant? And how would the Voice even know she'd received the phone call just that morning? But as we flipped to the article, in the dark, unable to see, with the 4 of us slowly shuffling over to the edge of the building where the street lamp shone, the roof's door creaked open once more. A man at the door yelled, "You motherfuckers!" and he stormed across the roof, soaking wet in our champagne. The front door of the building, like many of those LES buildings back then, did not lock. We hadn't anticipated this. He charged us like a bull, with his head down, ready to gore us and shove us off of the building. He was halfway across the roof. He was 2/3 away across the roof. Not knowing what else to do, I raised my arms up into the air, making myself as big as I could, as if I really was about to face off against a wild animal. And I began roaring at him, as if I was a grizzly bear. Celia, Rachel, and Veronica, they all followed my lead and raised their arms up into the air. And we roared! This man slowed. This man stopped. We surrounded him and roared. Instead of a bull, the man looked like a sewer rat lost on the roof's black tar. He stumbled backwards, falling over the case of beer. He said, "Fuck this," before taking 2 cans of beer that had rolled out of the box. He ran for the door, disappeared down the stairs, and us bears never saw him again. She just wanted to move on to her films. She hated that work was what everyone wanted to talk about. We hadn't heard anything about it until the first Voice article. That also talked about Andres Serrano's Piss Christ. You know, he'd dunked a dime store crucifix into a jar of urine. Just a pretty blatant comment on how religion is commodified and easily cheapened. Then there was a lot on Mapplethorpe's big exhibition coming up at the Corcoran in D.C. Now, he did some wild stuff, but a lot of his work was tame. A lot of that show was just pictures of flowers. And then there was Celia, who nobody had ever heard of before. Nobody told her that this senator stomped on her shit. He never reached out to her. No, we have no idea where he got menstrual blood and human feces. I mean, what the hell? There's almost no way that he saw Celia's solo show. And that NEA money wasn't even given straight to her. And she barely got any of it anyway. After the Voice article, the New York Post kept calling our apartment trying to talk to her. The Daily News, the tabloids, but none of the arts publications. The art world didn't know what the fuck was hitting them. Out of nowhere, there was Pat Robertson, the Christian Coalition. All these batshit crazy Jesus freaks were coming for the arts with their Bibles sharpened. Celia turned down nearly every reporter who called. Or, well, they'd turn her down after a few minutes. She'd only talk about her films. And when the reporters realized she wouldn't talk about the NEA crisis, they'd hang up on her and probably try calling some other artist who'd been attacked. She wouldn't comment on figure drawing. Not after the Post, anyway. The first time the Post guy called, she said she wasn't showing that series again. She said she wished she hadn't done that specific series, and he twisted it, almost making her sound apologetic for doing the piece. That really riled her up. She called this guy back, but she never got a hold of him again. So she called up the chick at the Voice, thinking she was cool, right? And Celia told her, "I do not apologize for making this work. I'm simply never commenting on it again." So the Voice writer took down that first line and ran with some headline about how Celia was taking a stand against all these people who attacked her. And that article, like every other article, used a picture from the figure drawing series. The tabloids in the Voice ran it uncensored. Tabloids obviously just wanted to sell more issues. And they did. She was absolutely everywhere for a few months. We'd watch the 700 Club on Sunday morning, and Pat fucking Robertson would mention her by name. Every religious kook in the country probably wanted to string her up. I mean, Mapplethorpe was already famous. But the funny thing is that if it wasn't for these Jesus freaks, nobody outside of New York would have ever heard of Celia Merode. I loved it. Yes, I loved it. Loved it. Loved it. It probably would have taken more than a year any other way. But with all of this NEA shit happening, we got her into a group show ASAP. The first night this thing opened, the gallery was the busiest I'd ever seen it because all the papers were talking about Celia Merode's first show since everything started happening. I mean, Not like big articles on her, but there'd be these little blurbs to fill space in the newspapers. And the art world reads those tiny blurbs, right? Some of these artists get mentioned in a mainstream paper. It could be just an inch-long paragraph. And they start thinking they're hot shit. They start talking to the gallery girls like they're fucking gods. Even worse than before they got any press. Celia was probably the only person in the place who wasn't reading any of the news. Jack Eagleheart, the painter and sculptor, he comes up to me during the group show I put her in, and he's pissed, saying, "Why the fuck do all these people think it's a Celia Merode show? Who the fuck is Celia Merode? Somebody just looked at my sculpture and said they didn't get why it was so controversial. This guy talking to her said it didn't look anything like a Merode. Who the fuck is Celia Merode?" I thought he'd punch me in the face. He was that fucking mad. But I knew where he was coming from. It was supposed to be an exhibition of sculptures, and there's no easy way to squeeze her photographic work into that category. Still, we put up 2 of her figure drawing photos, and they're student drawings. She was a total pain in the ass about showing those, by the way, but fuck it. I knew that anything from that series would start a commotion in 1989. I should have cut Pat Robertson in on the gallery's sales, or maybe even Gorbachev for tearing down the wall. Because now that the Cold War was over, these evangelicals needed some new enemy to focus on. So they picked little old Celia Merode of all people. Don't get me wrong, I don't like working with the flavor of the month. That's not why I do this. I want to work with somebody whose career is going to build and flourish and last until they can't get it up anymore. Because that flavor of the month is gonna drop out of the scene before the end of their precious month. And that's what it looked like for our Miss Merode. Because even with all that Christian hoopla, even with thousands of people walking into the gallery hoping to be shocked or offended, even with serious press covering the opening, we didn't sell any of Celia's photographs. We sold a lot of that show, a lot of the other artists. Most of those pieces were sold before we even opened, though. I'd shown Celia's photos to some collectors before the opening, but I couldn't get the right collectors to buy her work, or for the right price. Yeah, I could have gotten some prick who thought controversy meant longevity to buy these things, but controversy usually doesn't end well. The guys who you want to buy the art, to get the other right people to buy it next, and so on, and so on, they simply weren't interested. In a lot of ways, Celia just wasn't a sure bet for these guys. She'd only had the one solo show. Somebody like Mapplethorpe, though, his work did boffo box office during all of that shit. But he was a known quantity. He was a guy. Celia was an untried risk, and unfortunately for her, a woman. One of my collectors, he looked at the photos for a long time. I tried selling them, creating the narrative of this iconoclastic artist. He finally stopped pacing back and forth and said, "It reminds me of Cindy Sherman, but I think Sherman's hotter, so I'll probably stick with her stuff instead, if I gotta look at it every day." Don't tell Celia that. The group show wrapped at the end of the month, and I had to break the news to Celia. Well, I wasn't breaking it to her. Kelly told her that it just wasn't working out. "We're sorry, but we need to part ways." That's just how these things go. You might be brilliant. You might be what everyone's talking about. But if no one's buying your shit, we gotta break ties. We can't take you on as a regular client. Best wishes. Good luck with all of your future endeavors. I usually let Kelly break the news if I don't think the artist will start swinging at the messenger. And believe me, those fuckers can pack a punch when you stall their dreams. Or cash flow. Patrick was in Europe, but one of his major collectors, Arnie Hecox, visited the gallery to view one of his potential acquisitions. Mr. Hecox held the position of one of Patrick's most preferred collectors, the charitable arm of Mr. Heacock's mutual fund, regularly donated exorbitant sums of money to the Whitney Museum of American Art. His connections to the museum and its biennial were often an asset to Patrick's artists, and hence our gallery's portfolio. So Patrick allowed Mr. Heacock to visit whenever he wished, whether we were open or not, and whether I was anywhere near the gallery to open the door. Mr. Heacock had called ahead in order to view a painting in Jack Eaglehart's upcoming show. Until a show is installed, the upcoming work is often stored in the gallery's basement. People like Arnie Heacock are granted direct access to the basement. Normally, only Patrick escorted collectors downstairs, but since he was in London, it was me who Mr. Heacock followed into the service elevator. Since I knew he was visiting, I assumed it wouldn't hurt to set up a film projector as well. In his trim business suit, Mr. Heacock stared at the Eaglehart painting for many minutes. He held up his hands, blocking out the bland white walls that surrounded the piece. He said, "I'm trying to imagine it above our Paolo Buffa credenza." He stared longer, clasped his hands behind his back, and rocked backward and forward on the heels of his Italian shoes. His wide purple tie waved between his open lapels. He stared at the painting from inches away. He stared at it from the opposite end of the room. He touched the paint with his fingertips, which we didn't officially condone, but if somebody is about to spend $50,000 on a painting, they may test drive it however they like, as long as they don't do any lasting damage. After 15 minutes of this fidgeting around, he said, "No." I tried to not sigh when I said, "No." He said, "No, I'm afraid not. The dining room that I'm thinking of for this, my wife recently had it redecorated, and this would have been perfect for how it used to be, but it's just not going to work now." I said, "Maybe there's another room that it could be quite fashionable in, or perhaps your Hamptons estate, or the artist painted this in Rome, so perhaps it would be quite fitting in your Tuscan villa." He still said, No, I'm sorry, and don't worry, it's not your fault. I'll tell Patrick that it's just not what I'm looking for right now." Without saying anything more, he walked toward the elevator, and I said, "Mr. Heacock," and desperately tried to not sound desperate. He stopped and turned to me, obviously wondering why we weren't already going up. I said, "Patrick and I know that you are immensely busy, but he wondered if you might have a moment to see something brand new. Now, Patrick knows that you have been aching to see something truly avant-garde, something that will reign in the 90s with panache. So, if you have a moment, he would love for you to see a new artist's work, a young recent graduate from Cooper Union." Nearly all of this was lies. Patrick had never intended for anyone to see Celia's films. He probably didn't even remember that we stored them in the basement, in case Celia's other work had become a sensation at her debut, and we needed to show collectors more of her art. I don't think that Patrick had even watched them, but I had. Mr. Heacock said, "Patrick thinks I might like it?" He wasn't convinced. I said, "Almost certainly. We believe that these pieces have the potential to be shown alongside other groundbreaking works, maybe near Pollock's drip paintings or Warhol's soup cans at MoMA." As we spoke, I knew I'd be out of a job before Patrick returned from London. My heels clicked over to the projector. I checked the reels. He said, "A film? Oh, Patrick should know I don't do films. Where on earth would I set up a projector day and night? I'd never be able to enjoy it. Besides, somebody could just record it on a VHS tape and pop it into the VCR." I said, "Patrick thought you might say that," and I flipped on the switch. I practically leaped awkwardly across the room to hit the lights before the film began to play. I said, "But this is truly one of a kind. It's hand-painted. To make another copy, you'd need a team of painters working day and night. Skilled painters. He looked at me as if he'd be on the phone with Patrick immediately if this was a ruse. Then the lights went out. The film flickered to life. On screen, Celia struts from left to right on a black and white stage. Her cape flutters from yellow to green to blue. It lasts no more than 30 seconds. The film went black and I turned on the basement lights. Mr. Heacox turned to me with eyes like a boy who just received his first kiss. He said, "It reminds me of when Dorothy first walks out of her farmhouse and into Oz." Are there more? Celia got all these offers to show the figure drawing series. If the Christian Coalition and the American Family Association don't want you to see it, it's gotta be good, right? Phone calls came from all across the country. But every time they call, it's just, no, from her. No. To this joint down in Austin. No. To an arts collective in Poughkeepsie. And a contemporary arts center in St. Louis. The St. Louis one wanted to show her work alongside pieces by Anna Mendieta and all these other women. And she still said no. I did not understand. Do you know how infuriating it is for your own career to go nowhere while your roommate is turning down offers left and right? She got off the phone with a curator in LA, and I yelled at her across the kitchen, "Who's paying for all this fucking long distance?" And she glared at me with her finger still on the receiver. She asked, "What's your deal?" She'd been calling these people back hoping that somebody was actually interested in her film work. I said, "I'm not splitting the phone bill with you this month. I've never used long distance in my life." And she said, "Your parents pay for your rent. Why do you care?" I walked toward her and said, "Because I don't want them to pay my rent. I don't want to work at the front desk of the new museum. I want to make art. I want other people to see my art. You have the opportunity and you're not even taking it. Do you even understand how few of us get this opportunity?" She looked away from me and said, "Whatever." She wasn't even going to show them with Patrick. She had to be convinced just to do that. And it wasn't even the last photo. She'd only show a couple of them after Patrick assured her that they'd only need to show them that one time. After he sold them, she wouldn't need to think about them again. She just needed to get rid of them while people were interested. But he didn't sell any of them. "And now it's all that anyone fucking knows me for," she said. "I can't even stand looking at those pictures." I told her, "You gotta drop your hang-ups with the figure drawing series. Who cares if people see them a few more times?" She looked pissed and said, "Are you serious right now?" I'm not doing it. I have been doing what other people want me to do since I moved to this city. I said, "Then why don't you follow through with your stupid threats and move back to the farm?" She growled some kind of barnyard noise at me and sulked into her bedroom. She slammed the door. Then she slammed it 3 more times before locking it. It was quiet for a while. Then I heard her mumble something, bumping around the room. She yelled, "Where is the fucking number for St. Louis?" We posted up at a McDonald's down the street until we got the call to raid this place. We were kind of laughing to each other in there because we didn't know how tough to be. We usually got this many guys together for a drug bust or something, but this was the St. Louis Arts Center. It's not like we were going to go in there and start busting skulls or something. Me and the other guys went to the exhibition's opening the day before because we knew we'd be ordered to shut this thing down, and we wanted to know what we were up against. This little group called St. Louis Family Values did all this work to stop it from opening to the public. They sent thousands of letters to people around here asking them to boycott anyone and anything that donated to the Arts Center. Basically all the major businesses in town. Then Family Values got loads of people to petition the sheriff to shut it down altogether because they thought it was obscene. And the sheriff, well, let's just say he was the kind of guy who got the front pew at church every Sunday. Don't get me wrong, I was shocked by what I saw in that museum. I've seen some stuff on the job, but this was some pretty raw stuff. There was this very close-up photo of a woman pulling a used feminine product out of her vagina. Why are you smiling like that? I don't have a problem saying it. I can say it. Vagina. Yeah, and there was another picture. It was this other woman. She stood buck naked on top of a table while pulling this long piece of paper out of her vagina. I had no idea there was such a plethora of vaginal art. I don't think I'd call any of it pornographic, though. I couldn't be turned on by it. So that was intentional. So does that mean it was good then? Well, I don't know if I mean good, but it was doing what it was supposed to do, I guess. Yeah, we got closer to the main entrance and it was just packed. Hundreds of people waited for us because word had spread about the sheriff shutting it down in the morning. So many people protesting us, and they weren't just your average hippies on a nostalgia trip that you'd see at most protests then. It was regular citizens, businessmen, students, housewives. They'd kind of blocked the door. Some of our guys got aggressive. Smith shoulder checked some guy so he could get through, and the guy fell back into a bunch of other protesters, and they're all yelling at Smith and the rest of us, and it really felt like all hell was breaking loose before we even got in the door. I passed the guy who'd been knocked over, and I reached down to help him up, but he just refused my hand and yelled, "Fascist censor art." All right, buddy, all right. We walked in the door. That museum's lobby normally felt enormous, with this really great glass dome on top that lets in all this light. But there were so many protesters in there that I got claustrophobic. People are yelling, people are chanting, people are waving signs around. I noticed Williams up ahead of me with his hand on his sidearm, like we might actually be in danger. So I thought maybe we really were in danger. And Smith again plowed through some guy who started this domino effect of people tumbling over. So we just get booed. This whole lobby echoed with boos louder than the St. Louis Arena when one of the Blues gets a penalty. Then it got quiet and quieter. I wasn't sure why until everyone turned to the staircase leading up to the galleries. The museum's director stood up there trying to talk to everyone. People shushed each other until it was dead quiet, but there was this incredibly tense heat from all the emotion in the room. I don't even remember what the director said. I just remember his very calming voice. If he didn't come out, if this didn't happen at a museum, if it was somewhere else, I think somebody would have gotten killed.
It was a unanimous decision. Every one of us on the council voted to approve Celia Merode's NEA grant for the second year in a row. And not only did we approve it, we increased her grant to $15,000 for the fiscal year 1990. And it was an easy decision. She had applied by submitting the work she made with the previous grant. The films are simply marvelous. Not only are they aesthetically pleasing, she used a truly American medium that went back to Thomas Edison and the earliest films he made in the first movie studio in the world. Yes, Edison's films were colorized in much the same way. When you watch an original hand-painted film from the Edison studio, such as Annabelle's Serpentine Dance, where a woman waves the arms of a billowy dress that constantly transform with vibrantly colorful flourishes, you are aghast that this was actually possible in 1895, and that many people saw this really before they'd even seen an automobile. But it was an art form that, at least in its original form, largely disappeared from the world. Yes, television shows like Gilligan's Island or I Dream of Jeannie were colorized for viewers in reruns, but that was done by computers. Gilligan and the Skipper certainly weren't hand-painted by anyone. Celia, on the other hand, was making work that felt grounded in both history and the future. The chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, however, is a political appointee. He was so afraid that Congress might abolish the endowment that for all grants given in 1990, he made the artists sign a loyalty oath, saying that they would not produce obscene work. It was an incredibly broad contract. I remember the worst part of it word for word. It said that recipients may not produce works that do not have serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. Depending on a person's definition of serious, nearly anything could be found objectionable. By late 1989, Celia's two NEA-funded shows and her own completely unrelated grant for FY89 were simply too much. Never mind that Celia received most of those NEA funds only tangentially. Maybe the NEA paid for her work to be shipped to St. Louis. Perhaps Celia's funding arrived through one of the museum's other major contributors. It didn't matter. Celia's crucifixion was included in a barrage of mailers sent to the American Family Association's membership across the country. The dates for each of the shows and her unrelated grant were included beneath the photos, as if to let members know that this is happening over and over again, even after they made a fuss about it. The mailer asked, "Why are you paying for Christianity to be mocked?" These mailers often said that this wasn't an issue of censorship, even though they censored her breasts in the Xeroxes. They contended that this was about taxes. Well, if you broke down how much of an average person's paycheck went to Celia's work being shown, you'd need to start the decimal point here, and then have a long stretch of zeros that string across this entire room until you hit upon an actual fraction of a penny. Using their logic, I wonder how many of them were comfortable paying for the Iran-Contra affair, or the My Lai massacre. I won't say that Merode's work is any more or less controversial or pornographic than Piss Christ, or Annie Sprinkle's work, or Mapplethorpe's work. Frankly, I'm certain that the Mapplethorpe show in Cincinnati was shut down because the local men felt inadequate compared to the men in the photos, like Mr. 10.5. But I digress. The AFA's metrics on morality are arbitrary, and no serious person on the NEA Council should ever consider them. The chairman, however, still had final say on what was awarded. The House and Senate were increasingly adamant about abolishing the NEA. So after our council unanimously voted to award Celia the $15,000 grant, the chairman slapped us all across the face and vetoed it. And that, in a beautiful stroke of irony, made Celia a household name. It was so cold today that Celia Merode wore clothes.